This is the fifth in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. Past programs in this series have dealt with the following questions. What are some characteristics which seem to be common among human beings? And here I'm alluding to mental, emotional characteristics, which might be typical of most, if not all, people. And in last week's segment, I dealt with the question, what role do our genes and environment play in determining human nature? In other words, I dealt with the debate concerning nurture versus nature. Today's program will deal with this question. Given our human nature, what tends to fulfill us? What tends to satisfy us? In other words, given our human nature, what's the good life? Before getting to that question and some of the responses some of the great thinkers have made to it, let me provide a brief review of last week's program, again, which dealt with the question, what role do our genes and environment play in determining human nature? I mentioned that St. Augustine, many centuries ago, claimed that it's mostly nature and not nurture that determines human nature. St. Augustine believed that because of Adam and Eve's sin, we are all stained with original sin, and therefore we have a propensity towards evil and must work at being good. Herbert Spencer, a 19th century British philosopher, became known as a social Darwinist. And what did the social Darwinists believe? Well, they believed that highly successful people usually are people who are genetically superior to other people. More recently, Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson and MIT professor Steven Pinker have addressed themselves to this question. And both Professor Wilson and Professor Pinker have come to the conclusion that human behaviors, in general, are genetically shaped. They claim that our genes predispose our brains to favor certain kinds of behaviors. On the other side of the debate, those who support the idea of nurture more than nature, Mencius, a Chinese philosopher who lived more than 2,000 years ago, claimed that by nature people tend towards goodness, but that if they become corrupted, it's because their environment has corrupted them. And in the 20th century, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner became very famous, among other reasons, for his psychological novel entitled Walden II, in which he has a character say the following: men are made, good or bad, and wise or foolish, by the environment in which they live. More recently, Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould and University of Pennsylvania professor Arthur Caplan have argued that it is the environment more than our genes that ultimately determine human nature. Indeed, Stephen Jay Gould, again former professor at Harvard, claimed that those who were emphasizing genes versus environment were engaging in what he called reductionist science. He thought it was foolish, harmful, in fact, is the word he used, to ascribe particular behaviors, whether physical or mental, to a particular gene. And more recently, University of Pennsylvania professor Arthur Caplan has said this. He says our genes can produce a wide array of outcomes depending on the environment in which they are activated. I then looked for some common ground between these two camps, and I mentioned that I think science writer Erica Goode, in a piece she wrote in the Science Times several years ago, provides illumination. She says this, that the nature versus nurture dichotomy is in a certain sense false. Why so? Well, Erica Goode claims that both people or I should say both sides of this debate, agree on one thing. Those who emphasize genes and those who emphasize environment in shaping human behavior both agree that both genes and environment do play a role in determining human behavior. The disagreement concerns the balance. Is it more genetic or is it more environmental? And as of 2006, we have no definitive answer to this question. Now on to today's question. Given our human nature, what tends to fulfill us? What tends to satisfy us? And before providing some answers from the great thinkers, let me briefly go down some of the characteristics which I've attributed to human nature, or which I claim, based on what the great thinkers have said, to be part of our human nature. I mentioned that we human beings are desirous and fearful. In fact, some thinkers have described us as being bundles of desires and fears. We are also very complicated creatures. We can be ambivalent. Freud said it's not unusual that we love and hate the same person. And Pascal, the famous French intellectual, talked about our moral ambivalence. He and so many other thinkers claim that there are two natures in us when one talks about morality, and that one of those natures is good and the other bad. It's also been said that we have an inclination to mask wearing, role playing. And it's been said by so many of the famous thinkers that by nature we are aggressive. Indeed, it's been said by many that we have an instinct for aggressiveness. But it has also been said that despite this inclination towards aggressiveness, that we are capable of compassion, of love, of goodness. Indeed, some of the great thinkers believe that while we may have an instinct for aggression, we may also have an instinct for compassion. It's also claimed that our human nature is such that we experience much unhappiness. We suffer, but despite the fact that we experience much unhappiness, we are capable of joy. We are capable of tranquility. And finally, at least when I say finally, I'm referring to some of the characteristics I talked about, because obviously this list has no real end. I pointed out that so many of the great thinkers have said that we human beings are easily distracted, and that we tend to live in the past and the future, that we have difficulty concentrating on the present moment and living in the present. Okay, what tends to fulfill us? Again, given our human nature, what tends to fulfill us? I think Aristotle provides a good introduction to the answer to this question. Aristotle began one of his most famous books with this sentence, and I'm quoting him: "Human beings by nature desire to know." Aristotelian scholar Mortimer Adler claims that what Aristotle was saying, in other words, is this. He's saying that the desire for knowledge is as much a natural need for us as the desire for food. Aristotle claimed that some kinds of knowledge are more important than other kinds of knowledge. And here Socrates provides some illumination. Socrates claimed that when he was very young, he was very interested in science. But as he grew older, he came to feel that science could not answer the most important question. And what's that question? The question is, how shall I live? Aristotle believed that wisdom is knowledge of the highest things. Socrates and Plato also believed that. And what is knowledge of the highest things? Well, it's knowledge that helps us to live better. Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher, helps us out here, I think, to understand what Aristotle and Socrates are talking about. Spinoza said that to live better, we need adequate ideas. And what are adequate ideas? According to, again, this very famous Dutch philosopher, Spinoza, adequate ideas are ideas that help us to control our emotions. Whereas inadequate ideas are ideas, if we are controlled by them, it means that our emotions tend to control us. Again, inadequate. We have inadequate ideas when our emotions are controlling us. Again, in contrast to having adequate ideas when we are controlling our emotions. Spinoza went on to say this, and I'm quoting him: "The person suffers the most who is most governed by inadequate ideas." Very specifically, what have many thinkers claimed is the most important kind of learning, the most important kind of understanding we can achieve? Well, there is a kind of consensus among them that learning how to deal with the following is extremely important. Learning how to deal with anxiety, nervousness, disappointment, boredom, loneliness, lust, feelings of inferiority, feelings of inadequacy, learning how to deal with injustice, learning how to deal with other people. That if we can learn how to deal with these aspects of daily living, then in a certain sense we are acquiring the highest kind of knowledge. What it involves essentially is increasing our tranquility and decreasing our stress level. Some call this emotional education. Others call this spiritual education. I think it's unfortunate in the United States that philosophy courses and psychology courses are not required at the high school level. Indeed, generally not required at the university level either. Between 10 and 15% of U.S. adults are currently taking antidepressant medications. And how many others, including teenagers, use illicit drugs or consume alcoholic beverages in excess? Daniel Goleman, a Harvard-trained psychologist, in his very fine book entitled Emotional Intelligence, a book I highly recommend, contends that all schools in America should have a required course in self-science. He claims that it's not enough that students learn chemistry and history and mathematics. He claims that these courses can't provide students with an emotional education, and therefore we need a course specifically designed to do just that. And he would entitle it Self-Science, or title something like that. Again, it would be a course to help people, students particularly, deal with their emotions. The religion of Buddhism also provides much illumination here. In fact, some refer to Buddhism as a science of the mind. Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, believed that Buddhism is much more than a religion. Indeed, Nietzsche believed that perhaps calling Buddhism a religion was a mistake. Nietzsche believed that Buddhism, as he saw it, was more a system of mental hygiene. The Buddha claimed that the most important task in life is taming our minds. Again, the most important task in life, according to the Buddhists, is taming our minds. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, one must examine what the Buddhists believe is the nature of the typical mind. Buddhists often describe the mind as being like a drunken, crazed monkey cavorting about in a cave, or in a cage, excuse me. The idea is that our mind wanders. We find it difficult to control the mind, and we are easily distracted. And the idea also is our thoughts can cause us great discomfort. The Buddha said this: your worst enemy cannot hurt you as much as your thoughts uncontrolled. He then goes on to say, but once mastered, But once you master your thoughts, no one can help you as much, not even your father or your mother. Well, the question is, how does one go about taming the mind? Well, the Buddhists claim that in order to do that, we must engage in thought monitoring, mood monitoring. We must think about our thinking. We must think about our moods. The idea is that when we are sad or envious or very anxious, it's important that we realize that we are aware of ourselves enough to understand that, and then once we understand what state our mind is in, to then to find some antidote to it. So if, for example, we are feeling very envious, we must come up with some antidote to that. The Buddhists, by the way, claim the best antidote to envy is compassion. The idea is that if you realize that the person you envy suffers, because all human beings suffer, and you zero in on that person's suffering rather than some aspect of his life that you envy, well, then you may have compassion for that person and you'll be relieved of your envy. And envy is a discomforting thought. It's a thought that causes us unhappiness. The Buddhists claim that if we wish to tame our minds, besides engaging in thought monitoring and mood monitoring, it's also essential that we reduce our ignorance. The Buddhists claim that our ignorance causes us much pain in life, and they talk about specific kinds of ignorance from which we suffer. For example, ignorance about human nature. So many people have illusions about human nature, mistaken ideas about human nature. Many people have mistaken ideas about their own individual nature. Many people have illusions about reality. They're ignorant about the nature of reality, the way things really are. They are governed by illusions, and these mistaken ideas cause them daily suffering. Whereas, if they weren't very ignorant about the nature of reality, if they had a good handle on reality, again, on the way things really are, they would suffer less, according to the Buddhists. The word Buddha, or the name Buddha, literally means the one who waked up. And the Buddhists claim that if we are progressing in life, emotionally, mentally, what we are doing, in effect, is waking up. The question, therefore, becomes, how do we go about waking up? How do we go about waking up? What can wake us up? Well, so many of the great thinkers have said that good books can wake us up. Good books in psychology, philosophy, religion, literature, science, etc. MIT professor Noam Chomsky has said, we will probably always learn more about ourselves from novels, good novels, great novels, than from science. Great novels can provide insights about human nature, about human behavior. And of course, among the great novelists who provide these insights, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Cervantes, among male writers, and there are many others, by the way, and among female writers, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, and Willa Cather. I'm kind of partial to Willa Cather. And in philosophy, of course, some of the great philosophers worth reading are Seneca, Plato, Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell. And in psychology, again, I'm leaving out many important writers, but in psychology, Freud, Adler, Jung, among others. And in religion, I think reading the holy books of the great religions can be very helpful. The Hindu, Bhagavad Gita, the Buddhist, Dhammapada, the Jewish Old Testament, the Christian Holy Bible, and the Islamic Quran. If we are going to wake up, besides reading significant books, it's also important that we engage in introspection. And here we need solitude and silence. We need to engage in deep listening to ourselves. Indeed, both Jesus and Buddha temporarily withdrew from society. Both Jesus and Buddha did some of their best thinking in solitude and silence. Today, as you know, some people seek out religious retreats. Some people go on religious retreats, sometimes for a week, even more than that in some cases, less than that in other cases. But they go on religious retreats to Catholic monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, etc. And during these retreats, they will quickly find out, if they're not already aware of it, that solitude and silence will be part of the prescription for engaging in introspection and moving to higher levels of awareness. The idea is that we should take time for silence every day. Turn off the television, the radio, the computer. Talk to yourself. So many of the great thinkers have talked about the importance of withdrawal and return. The idea that it's very important to periodically withdraw from people, but then again to return to people. Some people do this on an everyday basis. The idea is that we need other people, but we also need solitude. We need conversation, but we also need silence. Also, the idea is that each of us should be his own best friend. Spinoza put it well. He talked about self-satisfaction, and this famous Dutch philosopher put it this way: the highest thing we can hope for in life is self-satisfaction. The highest thing we can hope for in life is self-satisfaction. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his writings, emphasizes self-reliance and the idea that ultimately we walk alone in this world, and that even friends cannot do certain things for us, that we ourselves must do certain things for us. Indeed, Emerson has said this about friendship: friends such as we desire are but dreams and fables. To facilitate introspection, we can write our own meditation books. We can write down thoughts that make us tranquil. Also, we can take sentences and indeed entire paragraphs from newspaper articles, books, songs that we like, and write them down. I've mentioned in previous programs that whenever I read, whatever I'm reading, whether it's a book, a poem, a newspaper article, I always read with pen in hand. That's one of the reasons, by the way, I don't usually use library books as my sources. I generally buy the books I'm going to use. The reason I buy them is I wish to write in them. And when I must rely on library books, obviously I can't write in them, but I take notes as I am reading. So again, I suggest to you that something that might facilitate your efforts at introspection and my efforts at introspection is composing our own meditation books. Also, as I mentioned before, if we wish to facilitate our introspection, it can be very important to read some of the great holy books. We can also take vacations in our minds. How so? How does one take a vacation in one's mind? Well, I very often enjoy sitting near a window when the sun is pouring through that window. It helps put me in a good mood and helps me feel more introspective. Also, we can visit a church or a mosque or a synagogue when no service is in progress and enjoy the silence and also perhaps enjoy the architecture of the building, both the silence and the architecture of so many religious buildings can help pitch us to higher levels of awareness. Or each of us can sit in a park by oneself. Or one can take a walk in the woods. I used to regularly take walks by myself at High Rock on Staten Island. In fact, we have been blessed on Staten Island with the Greenbelt. And I wonder how many people take advantage of all the trails we have access to. Because these trails, I think, nature in general, I think, can have a tranquilizing effect on us. In fact, one of the things I do when I'm in Holland in the summertime, and I pointed out in previous programs, I generally live in Holland in the summertime. If I'm in Amsterdam, I go to Vondel Park virtually every single morning. I try to get there around 9 o'clock. If you have never been to Amsterdam and you intend to go, or if you've been there but you've never been to Vondel Park, you are missing something. It's one of the world's great parks. What makes it a great park, in my opinion, what makes it a great park is that it is unusually conducive to helping people to achieve tranquility. You really feel like you're out in the country when you walk in Vondel Park in Amsterdam. Also, when I'm in Holland or any other country in Europe, I like to take trips out to small towns and to rural areas because, again, I find that nature has a therapeutic effect on me. And something else that can facilitate our introspection, besides writing our own meditation books and taking advantage of nature, is physical exercise. It's been proved scientifically that when we engage in physical exercise, we reduce our stress level and improve our moods. I see that I'm running short on time, so that next week I'll provide more illumination. Hopefully I'll provide more illumination on this subject. Again, the question is, what can we do to fulfill our nature? In other words, what satisfies us? What's the good life given our human nature? As usual, I'd like to close with a thought from Henry David Thoreau. In Walden, his masterpiece, Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. And he wrote the following line: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."